Business Media საქართველო. წარმოგიდგენთ.
It's a great pleasure to have today such a distinguished and honorable guest, the Senior Director of Penn Biden Center, Mr. Mike Karpenter. We have seen many times him in Georgia in very, very important and essential issues like defense cooperation between the United States and Georgia. So welcome to BMG Georgia. It's my pleasure to have this interview with you, Mike. First, I cannot miss this opportunity since you are our guest, since you have been involved in such an important issue of improving Georgia's defense and security capabilities. Could you give us your evaluation of the current status of Georgia-U.S. defense cooperation? What are the highlights? What was the most important being done in Georgia-U.S. bilateral security and defense cooperation, and what are the perspectives of developing this relationship?
Well, first of all, it's great to be with you. Thanks for having me. I think the bilateral U.S.-Georgian defense relationship really has never been stronger. It is extremely robust right now, and we've developed this new program called the Georgia Defense and Readiness Program, which I think is having a tremendous impact in terms of the readiness of the troops, in terms of how the military is organized. It's now adopting smaller, more nimble, agile units. This is how the U.S. is now fighting these days when we have expeditionary warfare. This is what Georgia needs for territorial defense as well. They've revised the doctrine to focus on more on counter mobility, on some of the inherent advantages that Georgia has, and on the weapon systems that are essential to deterring an adversary that has the military prowess of Russia. So Georgia is essentially adopting the model that the Baltic states have adopted years ago. And it's catching up. It's catching up rapidly. Georgia is already NATO interoperable, so it already has that advantage. And now it's really starting to perpetuate the deep reforms within the military, within the MOD, and we're just beginning to see the fruits of that. This is going to be, don't get me wrong, Georgia is not yet at a state where it is fully ready and capable of dealing with a full-scale adversary like Russia. But in 5 to 10 years, I think they will, you will improve, and I think you've already made tremendous progress. So the U.S. is the lead, I'm happy to say, is the lead partner with the Georgian military. That is developing nicely. Now, if some of our NATO allies would also step up a little bit, I think we really have some momentum.
You have mentioned NATO interoperability. Georgia has done a lot. I'm really proud to say, when I hear the U.S. top military command, Georgian soldiers, their evaluation of Georgian soldiers, we are the really battle-tested allies. And I have heard myself from U.S. militaries that first pick of the partners in the operations are the Georgians.
Yes, you're absolutely right. And for the last decade, the Georgians have been the best fighters that we have had alongside us in Afghanistan. But here's the problem. Unfortunately, for the last decade, the fact that individual Georgian soldiers have been so brave and so capable has not translated into the type of readiness that the entire force has. And so that's why when I was at the Pentagon, we launched this program for territorial defense, because we saw that the soldiers were extremely capable, but the units and the battalions and the brigades were not. So hopefully now we're catching up with that.
I hope so too. As it is said, really, that you're absolutely right to mention the Georgian, and I believe so, the Georgian soldiers, Georgian militaries are probably the best diplomats in representing our country abroad. It's 10 years since Bucharest. You've been there, you've seen yourselves all of these very dramatic developments. Finally, at the end of the very, very long day, we received the assurance, the decision of NATO that Georgia, along with Ukraine, will become the NATO members. After that was the war with Russia. 10 years have gone. It was a successful summit in Wales with a very good package. But Brussels summit is coming, and I don't have really a sense that something new and something very strong will come up. Correct me, please.
Yeah. So I agree with you that in terms of the open door policy, in terms of the NATO aspirants, unfortunately, the Brussels summit is going to be a big disappointment. Brussels will be important because it will reaffirm some key elements of NATO strategic planning concerning logistics and in concerning especially the reinforcement of U.S. troops coming across the Atlantic in the event of an emergency. And NATO will vastly improve its ability to respond to Russian aggression on NATO territory. So that's important. Unfortunately, with the aspirants, whether in the Balkans or whether it be Georgia or Ukraine, I don't see the summit as providing any kind of new motivational decisions or new language that will be empowering. But I think in Georgia's case, you're moving ahead anyway, which is absolutely the right approach. You're reforming, you're advancing, you're modernizing, and you're not waiting for NATO to give you the nod. And I think eventually the politics will catch up, and hopefully, that day will come soon.
United States had always been in the leadership, in the lead of supporting Georgia's territorial integrity, sovereignty, its Euro-Atlantic aspirations. We remember that U.S. was strongly supporting Georgia, granting the membership action plan, and there was the different position from several, certainly one European country. Until now, I could say that, and there was an argument that skeptical countries, and that there is a consensus needed in NATO. But right now, I don't see this leadership of United States on issue of Georgia's Euro-Atlantic integration. There were absolutely great statements made by the top leaders of the current administration, which I appreciate very much. But it shouldn't be. It should be translated into the real. Or what can the United States do in this political and geopolitical environment in terms of moving forward, Georgia?
Well, I think you're absolutely right. And look, I'm a big critic of the Trump administration, but I have to say that at least in terms of supporting Georgia's Euro-Atlantic aspirations, for example, Wes Mitchell, who's the Assistant Secretary of State for European Affairs, the Vice President when he was here, they've made very positive statements. So, Wes is someone who I trust and who I like and who I think has a very good strategic head on his shoulders. So I think they said the right things. The problem is that right now the United States is in such chaos internally, and we've picked fights with our European allies over the Iran nuclear deal, over other issues like the 2% spending within NATO, and that has unfortunately weakened our ability to lead the alliance on important issues like the open door. And so right now, I don't think we have the leverage, the diplomatic ability to convince our allies like France and Germany that this is something worth doing. And unfortunately, when Russia sees that there's not consensus within NATO, they love to use opportunities to try to stoke those divisions and ensure that the ultimate goal is not what they want. And so we're in this bad situation right now where we don't have consensus, and I don't see the U.S. taking or being able to take a leadership position, at least right now under this administration. But that doesn't mean that 3 years from now, 4 years from now, or 5 years from now, that won't be the case.
I hope that things will improve, things will change. But again, for Georgia, and not only for Georgia, for the entire democratic world, the biggest problem, biggest headache remains, and its name is Putins Russia. And Putin's 4-0 restart is again and again is demonstrating that nothing is going to change. United States are imposing the sanctions. At the same time, are still looking over the shoulder, trying to get some positive signals from the Russian Federation. I see in Georgia, and not only in Georgia, but Obviously, it's clear that in United States, in Europe, in United Kingdom, their actions are very brutal, very blunt, and very destructive. And this is already called meddling into the elections, and this is the attempt of assassination of the foreign citizens. So the Skripal's case is the latest. There are a lot of cases. So how could Georgia deter without further escalation with the Russian Federation? They have the Tatunashvili case, what they have done to our hero. They have tortured him, then they have murdered him in Skinwali regime's prison. And this dragging out this process of the investigation, and their behavior is not giving us a lot of many choices to deal with Russia in the normal terms.
Yeah.
Strategic patience. Sometimes I'm really getting very angry.
Yeah, I get angry with that term too.
Yes.
So first on Russia. I see Russia is going on a very clear trajectory. Russia was always aggressive within its neighborhood, which means here in Georgia and Ukraine, going back to the 1990s and the breakup of the Soviet Union. But with the West, there was a mantra, or at least a paradigm, of compete where you can, seek to gain an advantage wherever you can, but don't rock the boat and cooperate in certain areas. Not everywhere, but certain areas. That paradigm has been shifted. And now Russia is basically waging a covert war against the West as well. Not obviously in every domain, because they don't have an advantage in every domain. But where they do have an advantage, especially asymmetrically, Russia is interfering in our elections. It's using cyber. It's using information warfare. It's using corruption. That's probably the primary tool for influencing and subverting Western societies. And so Russia is on a much more aggressive trajectory. So to your question, so how does Georgia cope with an increasingly aggressive Russia? I think you have to maintain some semblance of stability here, but you have to strengthen. You have to strengthen your military, you have to strengthen resilience, and you have to prepare yourselves for the inevitable interference that Russia perpetrates here. So we talked a little bit about the military reforms, and for example, the purchase of Javelin anti-tank missiles from the United States, which is extremely important because, again, it's part of this hedgehog strategy of making yourselves indigestible so that if Russia attacks, it at least suffers the most amount of casualties and it gets as bloody of a nose as possible. That's a deterrent. And then at the same time, you have to strengthen yourselves by making yourselves more resilient. And that means better education of your population to integrate, for example, ethnic Armenians in Samska-Javakheti, using more language tools, more educational tools, using conscription perhaps as another tool to sort of integrate, looking at rule of law issues. I think that's crucial. You know, when the security services are politicized, it undermines confidence in government institutions. And that is, even though it sounds like that's not related to Russia, Russia takes advantage of that in your country. So you have to build greater resilience by, every shape, rule of law, ethnic minorities, greater social cohesion, and of course economic growth, because fundamentally when Georgia is growing, then both your budget for defense is bigger and the community is more trusting that you're headed on the right path. I think Georgia's made enormous progress in the last 25 years as we look at the history of post-Soviet independent Georgia. But there's obviously a lot more that you need to do.
Yes, a lot more is needed to be done. It is obvious that sanctions are still there, but things may change. It's always from every 6 months. It's quite difficult to hold this unity in these sanctions. Until now, it was more or less the strong transatlantic ties between the allies. So I cannot miss this opportunity to talk about the Iran nuclear deal and another very big issue, the North Korea nuclear deal. I cannot put this into the one folder, but both of these issues are right now are very hot, especially the issue with the Iran nuclear deal and the upcoming summit of President Trump with the North Korean leader. What are the expectations from the Singapore summit, if it happens, and I hope still that it happens? And what is the exit plan, and what is the compromise you can see in the issue with the Iran nuclear deal?
Yeah, so I think the Iranian nuclear deal and the recent elections in March in Italy are two very bad signs for Georgia and for the region, because the withdrawal of the United States from the Iran nuclear deal means that now the United States government is prepared to impose what are called secondary sanctions on European companies, which of course makes our European allies furious, because the United States unilaterally withdrew from this agreement, which has been blessed by the entire United Nations Security Council. And now, not only did we withdraw, but we're going to punish European companies by sanctioning them. So of course, Europe is now, the European countries, the major powers, are very mad at the United States for this move, and that does not help us in trying to create consensus to maintain the Russia sanctions. That's number one. Number two, this new populist nationalist government in Italy has, from sources that I have inside Italy, I'm told that their coalition agreement calls as one of the first steps for removing the sanctions on Russia, which they see as a detriment to their economic growth. And so that would be the beginning of the fall, potentially, of more dominoes, because if Italy withdraws from those sanctions on Russia, then what about Hungary and Greece and Cyprus and Slovakia? And that could really undo a lot of great work that the previous administration did to try to cobble together, and Angela Merkel, to her credit, did to cobble together this unity. So that's very negative. On North Korea, I don't know whether the summit will happen, but I'm a skeptic that even if it does, that there'll be any kind of positive result of any type. I think most likely Kim Jong-un is using this as an opportunity to sort of play the United States a little bit. Trump very much wants this summit to happen, and Kim is going to come and he's going to say, sure, I'm in favor of denuclearization, but the United States has to denuclearize too. And then what is Trump going to say? I mean, he's going to be left with nothing. And so, unfortunately, I think the North Korea summit is going to be a complete flop.
Okay, but okay, so you represent, you are the senior director of the Penn Biden Center, and you are working closely with Vice President Biden, whom I have great respect. I have seen in media earlier, from time to time, about the possible candidacy for presidential elections for 2020 for Mr. Biden. Do you think it can happen? And what's your feeling?
Well, I think he's given himself some time to make a decision. So he said that by the end of the year, he hopes to make an informed decision about whether he's going to run or not. I think in the last election, he was certainly considering and weighing the pros and cons of running for the election. And then, unfortunately, tragedy struck his family, and his son. His younger son died of brain cancer, right in the middle of the electoral cycle. And so obviously, as someone whose grandkids had just lost their father, he had other things to attend to. And so that was unfortunate. Now I think he's looking at the field. He's trying to understand, how things might play out. And so he's giving himself a little bit of time to decide. But if you look at the polls, the informal polls of potential candidates, he polls extremely well, and in some of these polls he defeats Trump by the widest margin of any of the potential Democratic candidates. So we'll see. It's his choice, not mine, certainly to make or to announce. But I think he's looking at it seriously.
It will be very intriguing. Thank you very much, Michael, and wish you all the best and the success back in the United States and in Georgia. Thank you very much.